Welcome to the sixth installment of ReFed's Better Together Food System Best Practices for Navigating COVID-19 discussion series. We hosted the first 5 installments earlier this spring at the beginning of the pandemic. Since then, we've continued to hear about best practices and key questions that are facing our stakeholders. So we're really excited to bring this back and to relaunch the series for an additional 4 installments that are going to be held over the next 4 weeks. I know many of you know ReFed already or have gotten to know us through these weekly webinars, but for those who don't, just a quick 30-second introduction to us and to our team. We work primarily to motivate and mobilize stakeholders throughout the food system to advance solutions to food waste within the U.S. With that view of the food system, we serve as first a source of data, insights, and best practices, also as a catalyst for promoting solutions-driven action, and finally as a connector to help facilitate partnership among our stakeholders. Today, we are really excited to focus on the topic of reemergence. Food waste matters now more than ever for restaurant bottom lines, for food supply chains, and for consumers. And as operators and others are facing a broad range of challenges and new experiences, it's imperative that the food waste remains a top priority. Seeing these challenges among our stakeholders, a working group came together a little over a month ago, including the organizations that are going to be represented by our panelists speaking today, as well as the James Beard Foundation and FDA, who are listening in on the conversation today. The goal being to develop guidance to support operators during this time. The outcome of that group is a resource that we are very excited to be referencing on the call today, as well as sharing out following the webinar later this week. It includes a series of best practices and guidelines for re-emerging from the pandemic and from future challenges, as well as a set of resources to help you explore further. We recognize this is a time of great volatility. Restaurants and businesses are closing and reopening, and in some cases closing again. So we also recognize that those on this call or those within your networks are likely within different points of that process. So our goal is to help provide best practices and guidance that will continue to be useful and serve you throughout the course of not only this pandemic, but future interruptions to supply chains and operations as well. Before I introduce our panelists, I'm going to ask Nathan to bring up a quick poll. We'd love to give ourselves, our speakers, as well as you an idea of who's on the call today. So if you can take just a second to select the sector that best describes you, that would be great. Wonderful. I know we'll continue to see some movement there and as people continue to join the call, but thank you for giving us an initial perspective. All right, with that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our panelists to get the conversation started for today. First, and panelists, feel free to give a little wave when I introduce you. First, we have Nell Fry, who is Senior Manager of Sustainability at Sodexo. She is responsible for supporting 13,000 Sodexo sites in North America to reach sustainability. Training and developing tools that help Sodexo sites measure impact and reduce waste. Next, we have Andrew Shackman, who is the CEO and co-founder of LeanPath, which is a mission-driven food service technology company that invented the world's first automated food waste tracking technology. Andrew and the LeanPath team have catalyzed the global movement to address the food waste crisis and are now working in thousands of food service kitchens in 40 different countries. And last but certainly not least, we have Samantha Kenny, Program Officer of Food Waste at World Wildlife Fund US, where she manages work streams engaging the global food service and tourism sectors. She also works to coordinate the global WWF network on food loss and waste strategy. So very excited about the panelists we have today. We're going to take a slightly different approach as we have on the different installments as we're presenting out on this new resource, and I'll be moderating a little bit more of the Q&A today. But as a reminder, please do submit any questions that you have through that chat function to questions and comments, and we will work those in as we're able to throughout the discussion. To start the discussion off, I'd love to ask each of our panelists to take a few minutes to talk a little bit about the food waste problem and give us a sense of what food waste looks like in this new world that we're living in and why it's such a vital issue to focus on, specifically through the lenses of operations, finance, and consumers. So Nell, I will start with you.
Absolutely. So food waste has always been a big problem. We know that. And it's, one of the top 3 items on Project Drawdown. So this is a legacy issue. This is not a new issue. I think everyone on the line today realizes that. And it's really always been driven by uncertainty, right? How many people are coming in? What are they going to eat? How well is this going to sell? And I think it's exacerbated when there isn't proper planning, there's poor information, or there's any disorganization at we call it a site or a restaurant, right? This has obviously gotten a lot worse. There's a lot more confusion. There's a lot more change going on, whether that's cities and states requiring openings or closures, changes in how we serve food, whether that's outdoor only, pickup only, etc. And then we have consumers who, I know personally, I have friends who are, going out to restaurants with masks where there's proper social distancing, and some that haven't eaten out, even gotten delivery or pickup in 4 or 5 months. So you have a wide range of different consumer approaches here, different levels of comfort. And we also have supply chain challenges, whether that's food or other materials, where things may become more expensive or harder to get for a while. So this is just really exacerbating this problem, as well as unexpected closures. I think we all, at the beginning of this, one of the biggest focuses was making sure that food that was in restaurants that could no longer be served because they had to close got to hungry people. There was a great response around that, and I think that we did sounds like a pretty good job, but I'm sure that we know we're going to continue having these types of disruptions, whether they are supply chain disruptions from climate change or additional closures from COVID. We know that there's going to be some instability in the medium term. And so having a plan in place to address that is going to be really important.
Thank you, Nell. Andrew, can we go to you to speak a little bit about the financial lens?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think first of all, this is a really challenging time, we know, for everyone, and people are thinking a lot about some things that we maybe haven't focused on as much, sanitation being, of course, one of the primary things that's been front and center. And I think it's really critical that people not lose sight of food waste during this time, because it's actually really tightly integrated into your ability to succeed. So if you look at the financial landscape, number one, for most operators, revenues are down. If you're closed, they're totally down. But if you're partially operating or operating with capacity constraints, you're definitely working with lower revenue. Secondly, your labor costs are likely up because you're dealing with sanitation activities that you haven't done in the past at the frequency that you're doing them now. You may also find that your direct expenses with packaging are up because items that you were previously serving on reusables, you're now putting in some form of takeaway, single-use disposable item, unfortunately. You may also find that you've got labor that you're investing in staffed service where there used to be self-service. And so all of this is a really uncomfortable, very uncomfortable set of, expenses that are coming together at a time when we can, really not afford it. Revenue's down, costs are up. Now, what happens if food waste then goes haywire in that mix and becomes yet one more piece of the problem? And I think the reality is food waste is a significant risk right now financially. You've got, as Nell noted, total uncertainty in most operations, limited operating history, if any, dealing with new menu items in many cases, or reduced menu sizes, maybe different products, different service modes, more stations spread out, different structures, all this stuff. How do you not have a lot of waste in that situation and have it just really hurt you financially? And so, I think the reality, though, is that waste is one part of this equation that people can control much more than the others. That by identifying it and seeing it and say, we're going to get ahead of that and we're going to plan for it and design a resilient approach, we have the ability for that to actually not be one of the parts of the financial equation that hurts us, but actually one of the solutions that helps us to offset some of those other areas that are causing a tremendous amount of pain. So, what's in this case good for the planet is also good for the P&L. And I think it's just really important that we keep people really focused on that so that, we don't get so focused on the sanitation side of the equation or other operating changes that we forget food waste is actually a huge opportunity for us.
Really, really great perspective, Andrew. Thank you for kicking us off with that. And Samantha, let's go to you now to talk a little bit about the consumer lens.
Sure. Thanks so much, Jackie, and Andrew and Nell for talking through those pieces. So we could talk a lot about how food service looks really different now in a COVID reality and a post-COVID reality. And really, consumers are entering this discussion from a really new perspective than they've ever thought on food and dining before. And they're also seeing a huge value in food that really wasn't punctuated previously, at least here in the US. So people at home they've experienced shortages at grocery stores. They've been cooking a lot more at home. They now have this choice of whether to begin dining out more, whether they're taking out, dining in, dining outside. There's all these new choices and anxieties around eating out that are really brand new. And on top of that, more folks are experiencing food insecurity for the first time, and they're also witnessing food insecurity in their communities that's on the rise and really unsettling. So consumers have a much higher value of food in many cases, and they're also much more aware of their position in the food system and how complex the food system really is that gets food from the farms or production areas all the way to their plates. So while food service operations are really in the most challenging time, juggling diverse priorities, new circumstances, we're also in the circumstance where customers may be more understanding than ever of operational shifts and menu changes. And also customers have very different expectations for their dining experience. In many cases, they haven't really defined their expectations for their dining experience, whether that's takeout or a sit-down restaurant, indoors, outdoors, and all of the context that goes into that. So consumers are really looking to restaurants and food service to tell them what to expect and how to communicate about food. In many cases, that can give us as operators and stakeholders an opportunity to really set the stage for how consumers will come back to these dining experiences and make that experience, first off, as Andrew is touching on, really safe, and all those considerations, new considerations going into food safety and safe operations, and also more efficient in different ways, especially making the most out of food that has an even increased value placed on it in our communities right now.
Thank you, Samantha. And yeah, as indicated by the title of this series, we don't want to just focus on the problems themselves, but also on the best practices and what we can be doing about it. But I thought it was great to take a diverse look at the problem, not just kind of all the observational pieces, but looking specifically on the operational, financial, and consumer side to get a sense of what we're seeing. So I appreciate you taking the time to lay that groundwork for us. We aren't going to necessarily go through that resource that we pulled up briefly on the screen today line by line, but instead wanted to focus on the themes and the content from that, and we'll certainly, as I mentioned, be sharing that out with everyone after the call today. But I wanted to start by talking a little bit about creating a culture of waste reduction. And again, we'll ask each of you to chime in on this, but I want to get a sense of how we can build food waste reduction into the culture of an organization, and what are some of the tactical examples or the priorities within organizations that we can be doing to build that. So Andrew, maybe we'll start with you this time.
Sure. So, I think if we start at, culture, it requires leadership, right? Culture forms when people champion things that they value. And so it's really critical to have internal champions around food waste as a cornerstone of building a food waste prevention culture. And so what that really means usually is having the chef or a production manager or a senior member of the team who has relationships with the rest of the team playing a role of identifying food waste as an issue that needs to be considered. And that person becomes a teacher, creates an element of accountability to make sure that people are paying attention to the topic, communicates around it at stand-ups, and generally creates an awareness. And so what we normally recommend is that for operators, and particularly as you're restarting here, make sure that you've got not just one, but two internal champions in every kitchen. And that's so that you, again, have this resilience where if one of them isn't working, or if there's a transfer or change or something, you've got that sort of experience and understanding built into the structure. And once you have that, it's interesting how almost a crystal-like structure forms around that champion, because they set the new norm. And we know that food waste is typically occurring, at least at the pre-consumer level, for a lot of behavioral reasons. It occurs when people are worried about something, they're worried about running out, or they're worried about, time constraints or whatever it may be, and they start adjusting, overproducing, overpurchasing, those kinds of things. And so the way you're going to address that behavior is by creating new norms and expectations. And the person that does that is the champion. So our first job is to make sure that we find our champion, and they're usually not that hard to find. Most chefs understand the value of food, and when they understand they have a role to play around this, then they usually will rise and say, I'm excited to do that. So, but you've got to engage them as a leader if you're running operations to say, hey, this is a really important part of the things you're talking about right now, because that's how we're going to begin to build a culture that doesn't waste food.
Great. Nell, do you want to build on that?
Absolutely. So I think that Andrew is touching on, it's kind of middle out or top down, these internal champions that kind of drive accountability. And I think that really what you have to have is twofold. You have to have those internal champions, and that's your foundation. The way that I kind of look at it with our company is if your boss isn't asking about it, you're probably not going to do it. You know, it needs to be someone who you are accountable to. You know that they actually are looking at this information and care about this. But I think that there's a bottom up piece of this as well. I know that some of our best champions at our sites have actually been in the dish room. People who have been in their jobs for a long time, care about this issue, and hold the people in the staff accountable. And they may not have a high ranking role, but they have a loud voice and they have a lot of respect from other employees. So you really have to have this bottom up, this understanding from every single employee that this matters, why it matters, and that they actually have ownership over this problem. It has to be something that's unacceptable in everyday operations, that when you see food in a trash bin or a compost bin, the first reaction is disgust and concern that we're wasting something valuable. Creating a culture where food is valuable is absolutely key. And that requires daily investment of time and focus, and helping employees get passionate about this. So it's not just a job expectation, but it actually goes beyond that, and it's something that's part of your role. It's how you do a good job at your job every day. Because with turnover, and I know like employees having a lot of different focuses right now, it has to be something that's kind of daily reviewed. That's why we created huddle cards that will be coming out with this resource that are actually enough to do 2 trainings a week for 52 weeks. That's the kind of reinforcement you need to keep this top of mind for everybody. And I think it's really just having people shift from thinking about it as convenience and cleanliness to just throw stuff out to, would you throw away the coins in the cash drawer because you didn't want to count them? It's worth actually figuring out. The other piece of this too, actually, I think, is that you have to empower employees to come up with the solutions to the problems. Eliminating food waste is a case-by-case basis. It's never a one-size-fits-all. There are a lot of best practices, but the best solutions are going to come from the people that are touching that food every day. And so really empowering people and celebrating successes when people identify ways to reduce food waste in their daily job is what's required.
Thank you, Nell. I love your coin analogy. That's great. Samantha, you and the WWF team have done a ton of work with hotel kitchens, both pre and during kind of the current pandemic. I'm curious if you have perspectives on this question, especially on how we can be sustaining change and sustaining a culture shift.
Sure, thanks so much. And yeah, my team works on 2 platforms. One is called 86 Food Waste, and it's comprehensive guidance and resources for restaurants to curb food waste, and Hotel Kitchen, which is a similar resource specific for hotel food service. So you can find either of those just by giving them a quick Google. But building on what Andrew and Nell have already mentioned, I think all of these are pieces of a sustained change. Food waste has to be visible. It has to be a talking point, and it has to be a topic that staff is very accustomed to hearing about. So there's those first conversations to plan for, but there's also a continued drumbeat of watching this topic continually in our operation helps us always become better and identify problems, especially when circumstances are shifting or operations are changing, even if that's just a seasonal menu change. Much more so perhaps in a global pandemic scenario. So making it visible, making it a common conversation, and then once you have this understanding of the topic, of what food waste looks like and its key drivers just by taking a look at it, it's actually pretty easy to guess why food ended up in the trash if you're looking at it. You know, it's not a mystery when you see 3 steaks in the trash that haven't been cooked and are kind of green. It's not a mystery why they're there. You know, they've been sitting for a little too long, and that's an adjustment you can make really strategically. So the real questions are how we cut down on this food waste. That's really operationally specific. It depends on your menu, it depends on your staff, it depends on your restaurant concept. And the big thing we found with sustaining change is the why. Why are we reducing food waste? And that is also something that varies by operation. At WWF, I can say we reduce food waste for the environmental benefits, and there's many environmental benefits to reducing food waste. There's other organizations that fight food waste to ensure that quality food feeds people that need it. Last but definitely not least, keeping procurement dollars working for you, not double spending on the same food item. So those are easy whys of why we're fighting food waste. But I think there's something even more intriguing, which is the why right now. And it's the why in the COVID context. And COVID really has an outsized attention on all 3 of those areas: the environmental impact, the social impact, and the business impact. And bringing your team into an effort that supports business resilience, that supports stretching your dollar as much as possible and maintaining efficiency and safety. I think it's a topic that staff are really ready to engage on. And we have such an operational disruption right now that we can really set the tone for how operations can look into the future. So it's not business as usual, let's disrupt now to start fighting food waste. It's brand new business operations, and how can we make them as efficient as possible right from the get-go. So it's a unique time for it.
Absolutely, thank you. And we have a little bit of a follow-up question there. I don't think any of you actually said the word measurement as a part of your response, but you alluded to measurement in lots of different ways: visibility, being able to kind of track and invest in time. So I'm curious what the role of measurement is in building a culture of food and of food waste reduction. So Andrew, knowing that's a really central theme for you, maybe start with you, and then Nell and Samantha, please feel free to chime in as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, I think Samantha said a moment ago, you've got to make it visible, right? And so measurement makes it visible. And so when I think about building a culture, and, you know, we've talked about champions from the middle, from the front line, you know, we've got to somehow have a way to bring them together, and measurement does that. So when you begin measuring, a few things happen. One, you learn what's going on, right? You understand where you have problems, and you know, waste becomes a guide to improvement, right? You start looking in a bin, and it's not, you know, a bunch of garbage. It's actually a bunch of ideas for improvement, because every one of them is an empirical representation of some inefficiency, right? So by beginning the measurement process, you will learn, and you will be able to work back and find root causes. And as Samantha said, they're different in each operation with each menu. But by looking at that, you can find the roadmap to make those changes. So that's, you know, step one. But there's the other part of it, which is just that measuring is actually in and of itself a change-making activity, even if you don't look at the data, because the measurement communicates a priority, that this is important. And Nell spoke earlier about, hey, if my boss doesn't care about it, maybe I'm not paying attention. Well, part of the dynamic in the kitchen is to get that just right, where we're measuring and we do care about it, but not in a way that's going to be punitive, not in a way where you're going to get in trouble, but in a way where we're constructively working on this together. We can make this change together, which is exciting. So by going through the process of measuring, people actually begin to change their behavior already, because it's something that's right in front of them. So I think you can view measurement as a broad-based culture change activity in the kitchen. It's also a route to continuous process improvement. It's a critical control point that, you know, when you think about critical control points around food safety, taking temperatures of the things in your kitchen. Just the same when you look at your garbage or compost, it is a critical control point. What's going in there is telling you a lot about your business. And particularly right now, again, to Samantha's point about why now, like when we don't know anything about the routines, and Nell mentioned this too, you know, this is going to be one of the first places we're going to learn what's going wrong or what's going right based on what's not in there. And so measurement has always been important, but ever more so right now because it can light the way.
Yeah.
Great. Now,
yeah. And so, you know, we keep saying this word visible. And our CEO was talking about this at a UN Sustainable Development Goal Champions 12.3 event. And he said, food waste measurement makes the invisible visible. You really don't know what's happening until you know what's happening. And I've done waste audits at a number of our sites where we actually go pull out the bags of trash, lay stuff out, and categorize it. And every single time I've done that, the results have been received with shock and embarrassment, unfortunately, I think to Andrew's point, where people feel a lot of shame associated with what's in there. Sides of salmon. I think that there was one where I pulled out 3 sides of salmon, just beautiful pieces of fish that were just a little bit over. And those things disappear because I think even in the moment of throwing them away, even if you aren't focused on this issue, there is some shame for anyone in throwing away that much food, especially really good food. And so we need, if we don't have this information, first off, it gets kind of hidden because no one wants to admit it's there, but also you don't really know, it's going to change, especially right now, and you need to see that information on a daily basis in order to adjust how you're doing business ongoing. So that measurement's really key, not just because it helps us realize what the problem is, because I can't tell you how many culinarians I talk to that say, oh, I don't have a problem with food waste. I'm really careful with my food cost. Because it's just kind of accepted as part of the deal. We need this information for them to first off recognize the problem and for us, and to actually have what they need to do something about it.
Great point.
Yeah, I think that was really fantastic, and I echo what both Andrew and Nell said, and to reiterate that if it's not being measured or monitored at all, there's definitely information you're missing. There's a lot of data in the trash, and if it's going into the bin and you think you understand what's going into the bin because you see what's going to the tables or into boxes or into service, it's a whole different understanding of your food service when you look at it from that side. So I would definitely encourage that as a first step. And also to say, I'm sure anyone on the line who's conducted waste audits before or has promoted a food waste tracking solution of different types has heard the, so after we've tracked for a little while, we'll understand what we're wasting. We don't have to keep tracking. We understand these problems now, and we can address them and move along. And what we found in almost any operation, things change so much, whether it's people walking through the door, new menu items, new staff, a piece of operations that's changed with no one really noticing it's changed just because one person works on a different shift or something like that. So tracking is always beneficial and helpful and strategic daily under normal circumstances. But I know I don't have to say that these are not normal circumstances, and the key drivers of waste in an operation this week are very different than the key drivers of waste 2 months ago and in 2 months from now. And with so many priorities, it can seem that measuring food waste or putting in this behavior, even though you're training staff and retraining staff on so many other things, that it might not be a worthwhile addition to the daily tasks. But when you see the actual amount of food that you can save that's being driven to be wasted by all of these changing circumstances, it's really strategic now more than ever because operations are so new and so different and changing so quickly. Even just in changing suppliers, or the supplier needed to find that item from another source than they had before. So it's lower quality or different, or your staff doesn't know how to handle it in the same way. Just separating your food waste and understanding what's going in there and how much, it can just raise an alarm bell when there's a real avoidable source of waste, and that can be dollar signs for your business and healthy quality food for your community as well.
Thank you. I think we probably spend an entire webinar focused just on that last question. So I appreciate the comments that have been shared. Just a quick pause to remind people that the questions and comments chat function is still open if you have more questions that you want to be submitting for panelists as we continue the conversation. And we've started to get into some great tactical examples that are outlined in the resource. Andrew's mentioned already finding internal champions. We just had a great discussion around measurement. I'd love to continue on that tactical thread for a moment and talk about some of the specific interventions that you would like to highlight as priorities for reducing food waste. So Nell, maybe we'll start with you this time and just let you each chime in on your favorite or something you think is most important from a tactical perspective.
Yeah, so one of the ones that I really love is setting up a food recovery partner. I know that a lot of the nonprofits and food recovery organizations on the line today will be happy to hear that. It may not be, the top of the hierarchy, the BA hierarchy, but it is so, so important for that engagement with employees. I think I like to call food recovery the gateway drug to reducing food waste, because it also helps it helps people understand the value of that food. When you see food that you would have been throwing in a trash can being packaged and given to people as meals, it really helps people understand this food has value. Somebody can really eat this food, and somebody who really needs it could be eating this food. And it helps really inspire that passion that's needed to think about this every day and own this as part of your job. So I love food recovery as a part of a measurement program partnered with it to create that culture change. Not to mention, it helps with the societal issues associated with food waste, and it helps keep food out of landfills.
That's great. Andrew or Samantha, would you like to add on to that or highlight a different intervention?
No, I second Nell's comments there. And I think the other thing it does, it sort of is it's a way of also identifying the prevention opportunity space, because everything you're donating really shouldn't persist in any kind of consistent way. Because if we're donating the same thing routinely, that is a roadmap for the areas that require our attention in terms of structural change. I think there's tons of tactical stuff right now, but I think generally this is taking place in the context of different operations, because we are trying to, basically serve people with a lot of constraints, right? So we have much more distancing. That's both with our customers as well as back of the house. And that means tactically more points of service in many cases so that we can get throughput through. So we've got maybe outside or a tent here or a food truck, or in a dining operation, we may have different service styles. So what we're doing right there is we're sort of sparking up a bunch of points of presence, which means minimum par levels of food at each point of presence, which means the opportunity that, because we're merchandising a lot of stuff, that we might end up with things that aren't optimally used. Whereas if we were drawing on, one central inventory, we could see it all. So just being very aware of what you're merchandising, what you have, being able to expand and collapse the number of points of presence based on demand, recognizing we may be open longer because we're trying to get people through. And as we're open longer, that means food may be sitting longer than it normally does. And so if we're used to having everything fit safely into a window of 4 hours, and now maybe we're open longer, we may actually have to change out product in the middle of a meal period that we didn't have to in the past. And there's risk there. So thinking about how do we use smaller vessels, make sure that we are, even though we're under a lot of pressure to be able to push people through quickly, make sure that we're not batching, too much at once, so that the more we can produce smaller batches, the more we will have less waste. And that's always true. But I think particularly in this moment in time where, there's going to be a lot of pressure during peak periods to get food through. Grab and goes are going to be a big part of what's going on, but we got to remember, just because it's a grab and go and, it's a salad or a sandwich and a clamshell doesn't mean it's not a waste opportunity, because we could easily make too many of those. And curated buffets, which have replaced self-serve in some instances, because there's a staff member there building an item and putting it in a box and handing it to someone. That's still a buffet in the back of the house sense, right? You're merchandising all that food. So I think all of those are areas, just as we're trying to distance and operate, that we just need to basically pull out the playbook we always use, which is to look at, how much we're merchandising, make sure we're matching supply and demand, and producing the smallest batches we can.
Yep, I'm happy to build, and those are really great points. And I'm obliged to reiterate the absolute most substantial step you can take to curb your waste is to start tracking it and to discuss the topic with your staff, because those two things will open the whole world of opportunities for reducing waste in all of the strategic ways that correctly fit your operation. And I believe that the resource we'll be sending out later this week touches on a lot of those opportunities you'll see. And if you're identifying a real source of waste, whether it's when you're receiving food in a shipment, whether it's coming out of your storerooms, whether it's ingredient prep or meal prep, coming back on guest plates in the case of a sit-down dining. If you identify one of those as a key area of waste in your operation, you plug that into Google, I'm sure if not one of our resources will pop up, another organization, there's a lot of really tried and true strategies to curbing waste at all of those points. And I want to highlight just a couple maybe unique to COVID is potentially that adjusted supply chain. So maybe the ingredients, the items you're receiving might look different or be a little bit different than you've been experiencing before. And definitely having transparent conversations with suppliers can really help understand what's going to come through the door and what might be necessary, start preventing waste on that storage side, and maintaining quality all the way through. And then just to echo the points already shared on donations, WWF approaches all of our work on food waste from a prevention first strategy. That's how you secure the greatest benefit for your business and for the environment. But right now there's a lot of things that can't be controlled. And in the case of an unexpected closure, you could have an entire walk-in or a few full of food that suddenly will not be served until an unknown future date. And at that moment, what you can do is send that food to a food access organization that needs it now more than ever. And having that contact at the ready to come and pick up that food is something that can really make a world of difference and can keep food from going bad in your operation, something you'd have to go in and start managing just to dispose of it even. So I'll mention that a really good place to start if you don't have a food donation partner on call is Feeding America's Find a Food Bank tool. There's also several local governments or state governments have really great resources on their websites for food access as well. So right now, more than ever, it's really great to have that contact at the ready.
Great, thank you. That's getting, I think, a really good glimpse of the types of recommendations that will be included in the best practices that are shared after this call. I want to maybe shift to another segment of those. We've talked a bit about measurement and some of the operational changes. There's probably another bucket around communications. And Samantha, you started off the call today talking a bit about consumers and the lens that food waste is playing in their perspective right now. But there's also kind of this consumer communication aspect that we need to be thinking about. And we do have a more conscious consumer audience, perhaps now than we have before. So how do we tell the story of all of this work when these changes are being made, either to, in part get credit, but also just to be building relationships with consumers and giving them a feeling of safety during this time of uncertainty as well. Samantha, let's start with you there. And then again, Nell and Andrew, if you want to chime in, that would be great.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, so we do have a much more educated and engaged consumer base. Just on the topic of food, thinking about dining, thinking about safety, and thinking about their community. We also have customers that if they're coming into your establishment for a takeout service or sit down, really any dining, they're looking around for things to read too. They want information. Actually, there's a real need to meet customers or guests from the moment they arrive. Because they're really looking, where do I stand? Can I walk into the restaurant at all? So there's a lot of touch points, and I don't want to lessen the importance of those touch points, especially in terms of keeping the flow of people at a safe and manageable rate as well. But just to mention that customers are really concerned on the topics of food and understanding aspects of safety and what the businesses that they are patronizing are doing for their community, the role that they play, and also that their attention is really open to receive information. And I'll just, one opportunity that popped to my mind is digital menus. So a lot of restaurants are shifting to digital menus just to reduce shared touch points. And that's one area that could offer an opportunity for you to share messages and stories with your customers or your guests. So if you're worried to post a sign about food waste or food sustainability or food donations, not because those things aren't important, but because they're not maybe central to maintaining safety and flow of people through your operation, A digital menu or a website could be a really great place to house that information. People are visiting restaurant websites more than ever just to figure out your opening hours, do you have a full menu, all these questions. And that could be a really great opportunity to put a few links in front of them, a little bit of a story or understanding that helps them understand your place in the food system and how they can engage with you on food and understanding the role that you're playing in the community as well. So I think digital outlets could be a really great option right now, and also just understanding that consumers are a little differently primed for this conversation than they have been previously.
You know, I just want to really underscore what you're saying there, because it's, you know, for so long we've talked about how to make really structural change in the way we operate food service operations and for that matter, grocery, consumer expectations have to change. And that has always been this big, steep mountain to climb, because how do you change the broad-based expectations of our consumers, right? And I think Samantha is really touching on the point that this is a prime moment where we can probably, you know, be bold and ask of people the change that we want. And, you know, I think about the you know, one of the classic ones in buffets was always the last customer and the first customer should see the same options in the same layout, and it should look the same. And of course, that last customer, that's all going to waste, right? That all that merchandising, the opportunity to communicate to a customer, you know, it says, hey, you know what, this is not going to look the same at the end. It's going to be cooked to order at the end. It's going to be, you know, whatever those changes are that we want to implement, let's think longer term. And how can we use this moment to reset and come out with a better model?
Yeah, absolutely, Andrew. I think that we're entering a period where there's a whole new set of ethics around dining. People care about how employees are being treated. People care about how you're sanitizing, about how you're managing back of house, how you're opening and closing. There's a lot more. I think consumers want to understand your strategy around COVID. It personally makes me feel safe when I can understand a restaurant's strategy around COVID. When I see that there's a depth to it, when I see all the different aspects of it, it helps me feel that they have done all that they need to do to make sure that I'm safe when I dine there. And I think that talking about how you've changed your menu, how you've changed the way you're serving food to reduce food waste as part of your COVID response, it shows the depth of planning that you're doing. And also, I think that there's some ethics on the side of the consumer where consumers really care about supporting local businesses and making sure that companies they care about, restaurants they care about, stay in business. And so this is a moment where I think that there's more flexibility from customers, and we should take advantage of that to reset expectations around some of these things, Andrew, to your point. And that it actually may be beneficial to your brand because it shows the depth that you're thinking about this.
Thank you all. Some really great opportunities, I think, highlighted there. Just in perhaps one of the more unique outcomes of the setting we're in is just some of the flexibility or at least attentiveness we have on behalf of consumers that we're interacting with. I had a question come in, and now maybe I'll ask you to start here, but anyone can chime in. There's interest about how you've been working, or your organizations have been working on food waste one step down with suppliers and or wholesalers and producers in your supply chain. So beyond just the operations that you can kind of control within the four walls, how are you engaging further back?
So there's a number of ways we have engaged further back historically. I'm not sure that that's been a focus for us over the past 5 months. To be candid, there's been a lot of challenges with supply chains, especially supply chains with the scale of ours, and helping our on-site teams get the food they need and help them adjust. Especially at the beginning, there's a lot of focus on getting PPE and proper protective gear to the right sites that needed it. So I don't think our supply chain team has been focused on food waste during COVID. I want to say that, up the supply chain. Historically, we've really looked at packaging sizes, so getting the right size for what we need on site. And then I also think there's opportunities around centralizing. You know, if you have scrap and it's in one place, if you have trim and it's in one place, you can actually do more with that. So I think there's a number of things. I don't know that it's something that's during a time when there's so many operational changes on the front end, it's harder to focus there.
Andrew, Samantha, anything you want to add to that you've seen as best practices?
You know, I think just the 10 by 20 by 30 initiative that Champions is doing, I know Sodexo has been involved in that pre-COVID, and others have as well, where just going to the biggest buyers and saying, we're going to take notionally the 10 biggest, buyers, and they're going to their 20 largest suppliers and asking them by 2030 to make the commitment to reduce food waste in half within their scope. And so that idea of magnification of impact, using your supplier relationships when you're one of the big guys to motivate that change downstream, and just recognizing that if you get 10 of them and there's enough overlap between these supply groups, transformational change should begin. So I don't think any of that should be changing because of COVID, but it may be a little bit delayed just because of the fact that, frankly, supply chains haven't worked the way they normally do. And we've had issues getting product, and things are getting lumpy in terms of things no one expected to be buying plastic at the levels we're buying plastic right now, for example. So, we've got to work through that.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. Our commitments have not changed around that. I think we had some programs we were doing upstream with our suppliers, and we haven't done additional ones since COVID started. I'll put it that way. But yeah, the Champions, or the 10 by 20 by 30 has been really valuable, especially it helps coordinate a lot of large players to put pressure on a lot of large suppliers.
Yeah. Great comments. I have one more question from attendees, and then I'm going to wrap us up with kind of a future-looking question. And I think we've started to address this. There's a good question about how to introduce a food waste prevention program sensitively during this time, when there's a lot of other priorities, even just with personal safety and whatnot within operations. I know the group has already talked a little bit about how we can frame food waste prevention strategies from financial and other perspectives to really create that as a motivating factor, but I'm curious what additional comments the panelists may have.
Can I jump into that one?
Yes, please.
This one I think is really fascinating, because I'm worried that this is not something we can afford to be tentative around. And I know people are really cautious about not wanting to ask too much of operators, but we have to open our operations and run them properly. And we have to do that regardless of the constraints that we're facing. And we're not going to compromise on washing our hands, and we're not going to compromise on any of the food safety sides of things. And we can't compromise on cooking food that people want to eat, right? This is, I guess what I would say, we can't afford to be selectively excellent. That's just not how operations work. We have to set standards and aim for excellence and at least certain expected performance levels, and food waste has to be part of that. So I guess what I would just say is, I don't actually think we're doing anyone any favors by saying, hey, we're going to open and not worry about food waste for a while. You break habits that may already be there from the past, or you miss the opportunity that Samantha and Nell have talked about, to reopen right and open with the right behaviors and ingrain those things correctly for this new moment. So I don't want to in any way be insensitive, I think, to the subtext of the question, which is there's a lot of pressure on frontline food teams. And the last thing we want to do is, ask them to do the impossible. I would just say is this isn't the impossible. And in the end, when you waste less food, you work less because you're not cooking food and making it and chucking it. And there actually is a labor component built into food waste. So that's something often people forget, that when we stop overproducing, there actually is overall a load reduction there. So I guess I would just say is I think this is much more integrated elegantly than people might expect. And this is probably not the thing to not do. There may be something that you shouldn't do, but this is not it. And by the way, one other thing I missed up front, we do some research on this. And one of the things that's fascinating, people have said to me, hey, sort of the next question around sensitivity on this is, well, we don't have much food right now because no one's coming in. We're operating very low volume, so we won't have much waste, right? Well, what's interesting is when you study this and you look at waste on a relative basis, so the amount of waste produced per dollar of food purchases that come into the operation, what we find is that as those purchases drop, the amount of waste goes up per dollar. So we actually become less efficient as we become smaller. And that's because we have less opportunity to rework things. And when we make an error, we're stuck with it and it hurts. So in fact, at this moment, maybe more than ever, we have to be paying attention.
Yeah, and I also think this is a question of resilience too. It's not just a matter of adding one more thing, or let's take this opportunity to do a little bit better. First, I think when we've been talking about making this part of the daily pattern of management, and it has to be a conversation daily, we're not talking about a 45-minute conversation daily. This doesn't have, the huddle cards are index cards that we discuss that are 2 a week. This is not something that's incredibly time consuming every day to manage. It becomes part of the way that you do your work, and it's actually really, it can save time actually if you're not producing food that you're going to throw away. So I think first, maybe the way that we framed it during this makes it sound like this big giant project to put in place, but really it's just enhancing the work you're already doing around production planning with additional information and asking people to think about this stuff. It's not a lot of time. And I think that if we're considering efforts that will actually help us save money, not just keep people safe, but help us save money and operate more efficiently, that's worth a little bit of time. Especially if it can help us keep our doors open longer term, because we have a more efficient operation. So it's about keeping our operations resilient to change so that we can weather these storms. So I agree with Andrew. It's really not something that you want to put to the side during a time like this. It's the thing that helps us stay in the game.
Yeah, and I'll quickly build on that. It's a really uncertain time, and no one really knows what to expect when they walk into work right now, whether it's safety, sanitation measures, or food prep, maybe new menu items, different responsibilities. In many cases, food service workers are working at completely new locations right now because there was closures, there was turnover, folks got new jobs. And I think that guidance on some of these operational pieces can be really reassuring. So it's not in an individual's hands to keep themselves safe and everyone else is an island. It's more that how can we act as a team to make sure we're all keeping ourselves safe. We're keeping all of our customers safe through sanitary measures. And we're keeping our operation as efficient as possible so all of us continue to have a job to come back to and to work on into the future. So I'll stop there. I think that having a checklist or having an understanding of how to do your job at optimal efficiency, or just really to do the best you can when you come in every day on some of these really uncertain topics, especially things that are changing now more than ever, it can be really reassuring to know that you're doing all you can to maintain your business and to do your job and serve your customers, serve your staff as best you can.
That's great. Thank you so much, all. And building on that, I'm going to ask for a 30-second lightning round, kind of final future-looking question here. And Nell, I think actually all of you at some point have brought up the word resilience. And so thinking about resiliency and acknowledging that this is certainly not going to be the last time we face a challenge like this, whether it be to the level of this pandemic or not, can you just give us kind of 30-second responses around the room of how do we prepare ourselves for that future? Maybe we go Samantha, Nell, and then Andrew to wrap us up.
Sure, I'm happy to, and I'm really glad to have had the opportunity to chat with Jackie, Andrew, Nell, and all of you watching on today on this important topic, because we're in really unpredictable times. We're facing unexpected closures and disruptions at a ton of levels of the food system and many other systems into the immediate future too. So this can be a big problem that we don't really know where to start. And a really good place to start is right within your four walls with the staff you find, your team backing you up, and with the things that you can control. And a big part of that is your food procurement. You're going to be purchasing food if you're a food service operation. How can you make the most of that? There's a group, Champions 12.3, I think Nell might have name dropped them earlier in the day, that presented a business case last year that showed a 7-to-1 return on investment for food waste prevention activities in restaurants. And that's really a no joke return when it comes to businesses thinking about keeping their doors open right now. There's a chance that return is outsized given the, as Andrew mentioned, the hikes in waste when you're seeing low business volumes. So have your speed dial ready, have your food donation partner at the ready in case of an unexpected closure or an operational shift bring your team into the conversation, bring your customers into the conversation. All of our responsibilities and priorities are changing. None of us are doing the same jobs we were doing in February, but keeping these relationships top of mind can help us build food service back that better serves our customers and our teams and our communities too.
Yeah, Samantha, I think you covered pretty much everything. I agree with all of those points. Have the food recovery partner at the ready. The piece I just want to kind of expand upon is create the culture now. Creating the culture that values food now will help you be resilient when future changes happen, no matter what those changes are. So having employees and having it be part of your culture every single day, that every employee is accountable for the food that they're managing, food that they're producing, will create innovation from your front line to solve this problem as it's happening. So I think that culture is just the most integral part, one of the most integral parts of this.
I agree. I guess I would just add that I think the reality of being resilient is that you have to be flexible and act quickly based on the change you experience. And that means you have to be mindful. And in this context, that means measuring things and paying attention and getting those early signals and reacting to them. And so I think, the reality is the way we're going to be strong going forward is by being really attentive to what's going on in the business, moving quickly, responding to the challenges in front of us, not being afraid to deal with problematic realities that seem really impossible, just walking into them and solving them. And look, in the long run, what is sustainability? I mean, we've been talking about this word for 15 or 20 years, right? And it's really, resilience and sustainability are very closely linked concepts. And that's where we are right now. We have to sustain ourselves through a difficult time. And so all the principles we've been talking about for a long time actually are never more important than right now.
Thank you so much, Andrew. And in our final 30 seconds here, I just want to say a huge thank you to all the panelists, not only for the time today, but the weeks and weeks of work they've put into developing these guidelines and resources that we'll be sharing after the call today. So a lot of time and effort on their part. Lily will have shared through chat here in just a moment a quick survey if people have a time to give feedback on the session today. And just noting that we will be back next week for a session on demand and inventory forecasting during and after COVID-19. So a big thank you again to our panelists. Thank you for joining us. And you can look for takeaways from this discussion, as well as the recording and the resource coming in the next couple of days.